Boker Tov. We'll begin today on Daf Yud Tes, the seventh parak. And this parak is called Ma'os Shenimtzu and deals with the issue of the 13 shofaros that we had mentioned in the previous parak. And what happens if we find Shekalim somewhere in between the various shofaros? And how do we determine the nature of that shekel that we find? So, for example, we had in the previous Mishnah Taklin Chadatin, the new shkolim from this year's Truma. We had Taklin Atikin from last year. We had Kinim, which are pairs of birds. And then we had Gozle Ola, which are younger birds that are used and dedicated for an Ola. We had Eitzim, Levona, we had Zovlik Pores, and then we had the Shofros for Nedava. So the Mishnah establishes that Moshe Nimtzu Bein Hashkolim, if you find Mo'os that are located between the Shkolim and Lebein HaNedava, so we have the first of the 13 shofros is called Taklin Chadatin for the new Shkolim, this year's Shkolim. And the very last of the group of shofros is Shiklei Nedava, which are voluntary gifts that are earmarked for what's called Keitz HaMizbeach, to purchase olos to be brought on the Mizbeach when the Mizbeach is idle. So the Mishnah establishes that in such a case, everything depends upon Karov. And Karov l'shkolim yiplu l'shkolim, l'nedava yiplu l'nedava. We actually make a measurement and we see what is the distance between the shekel that we found and the various shofros. Which is the closer of the two? Is it closer to the taklin chadatin or is it closer to the nedava? And this principle of Holchen Achar HaKarov, as Lidabos Karov, is based on a parasha of Egla Rufa, where the Torah tells me that when you find a slain body between two cities, which city is considered responsible? Where did the murderer come from? And we do a measurement and we determine which is Karov. Now, there's another principle in halacha that if we find something unidentified, then we go basa rov, and it all depends upon the majority. So, for example, Rabbi Chanina in the Gemara in Baba Basra in Perek Sheni on Daf Chav Gimel, he's of the opinion that if you have rov versus karov, then anslinin basa rov. And the question is, how is he going to reconcile himself with our Mishnah? Because our Mishnah says everything depends upon Karov, whereas Rabbi Chanina is of the opinion that Rov is Kovea against Karov. And let's look at these two shofros and see and determine which one has more shkolim inside. And the Mishnah doesn't even reckon that as a factor. And the Mefarshim say, in order to reconcile Rabbi Chanina with our Mishnah, we're going to have to assume that they counted the numbers of shkolim in each of these two shofros that are in contention here, and they found that they have the exact number of shkolim, so there's no rov whatsoever. It's mechzal mechzal. Therefore, Karov is going to determine. Now, what happens, says the Mishnah, in an event where you find it equidistant between the two shofros? Mechzal mechzal yiplu l'nedava. And that means that we're going to give that shekel, that undefined found shekel, the status of Nedava, and assume that it came from the shofar of Nedava. And the reason for that is because the Mishnah is going to coin a principle here at the end of the Mishnah that's going to apply in three different scenarios, the first of which is ours, of Safek L'chumra, that when we don't know if it belongs to either A or B, we see which is more machmir. And in this case, if we attribute the shekel to the shofar of Nedava, then that's a chumrah above and beyond taklin chadet. That has to do, as we'll see later on, with various karbanos that are brought. And a carbon ola is more chabur than other karbanos. Now we have case number 2. Now keep in mind that there's something very strange going on in our Mishnah, and the Gemara is going to immediately pick up on this because taklin chadetin is the first of 13 shofros, whereas Nedava is at the end. It's after number 7 and on. The Mishnah should have presented a scenario in which we find most between 2 shofros that are next to each other. So the Gemara is going to address it. Case number 2, bein eitzim lilavona. And you find shkalim that are between the shofar for eitzim, which is right next door to the shofar lavona. And once again, the same principles will apply. Karv li'etzim, yiplu li'etzim, lavona, yiplu lavona. Mechtzal mechza, we go l'chumra, and yiplu linavona. Because lavona is considered guf hakdusha. It's subject haktorah al gabi mizbeach as a korban. It's part of the korban of shtei alechem, of lechem apanim. Masha einkein eitzim, although eitzim are used on the mizbeach, but nevertheless they're only a preliminary, a hechsher. They're not gufo kodesh. So therefore we go lechumra, and we attribute these shkalim to the lavona. Now we have case number 3. Bein kinim legozle ola. And again, karv lekinim, yiplu lekinim, karv legozle ola, yiplu legozle ola. Now what about mechtal mechza, which is more chamur? Yiplu legozle ola. Now, this Mishnah reflects the shita of the Chachamim in the previous parak, who maintain that in the case of kinim, we have a set of 2 birds. One bird is going to be sacrificed as a chatos and the other as an ola. Whereas gozle ola are pure ola, 100%. Now, chatos relative to ola is kal. Ola is more chum. And the reason for that is because ola is kulo kolil, it's completely burnt, whereas chatos has an element of basa that's nechal l'zichrei kuhuna. So in this case, where we don't know whether it came from kinim or from gozle ola, then in that suffix we have to go l'chumra, and we attribute it to gozle ola, and if we have no karban chatos here but pure ola. And finally, the last case is bein chulin lemaser. Let's say, for example, I have a wallet, and in that wallet I could keep my coins, and they are chulin. I have another wallet which is designated for Meiser Sheni. It has kedusha. That money has to be spent in Yerushalayim. And now I find Mos in between these 2 kisim. So the halach is the following: that karv l'chulin yiplu l'chulin, karv l'meiser sheni yiplu meiser sheni. We could already guess that in the case of mechtal mechta, we have to go l'chumra. Is mechtal mechta yiplu meiser sheni. It has all the chumras of kedushas meiser sheni, and it has to be spent in Yerushalayim. Now the Mishnah gives us the general rule that applies to every case of suffix of mechtal. Mechta zaklal holchim achar korov. We can rely on korov, even lahakel, but mechtal mechta we have to be machtir. So the Gemara right away raises the question that we raised when we learned the Mishnah about the case of Mos Shenimtzu Bein Shekalim Linidava, which was the very first scenario in our Mishnah. And the Gemara understands that the kubots, the shofros, are situated in a line, a straight linear line, and therefore it's impossible to find Mos between the shofar of Shekalim, which is the first of the 13 shofros, and the shofar of Nidava, which is the last of the line of shofros. So the Gemara asks, Lo hutzacha de lo ben Shekalim lekinim. Wouldn't have made more sense if the Mishnah would have approached the case where you find Mos between Shekalim and Kinim, because Shekalim and Kinim are right next to each other, but Shekalim and Nidava are nowhere near each other. So that the Gemara is basically arguing that it would have been more sensible to talk about a case where you find Mos between two shofros that are smuchim zelazeh. I just want to mention here that this example that the Gemara is presenting as an alternative, where he finds Shekalim between the old Shekalim, which means Atiki, because if you take a look at the Gemara says Bein Shekalim Lekinim, which means that there are two adjacent shofros. Now, which Shekalim is he referring to? If he's referring to Chadatin, between Chadatin and Kinim is Atikim. So we're going to have to interpret the word Shekalim here as referring to Atikim, because the shofar of Atikim, which is the second in line, is proximate to the third in line, which is Kinim. Now, if the Mishnah would have approached the first scenario of two proximate shofros, it would have mentioned the first and the second. And you find Shekalim between Atikim and Chadatim. Why does the Gemara skip over that case and go to the second shofar, which is Shekalim Atikim, and the third shofar of Kinim? Why not between the first, which is Chadatin, and the second, which is Atikim? And the answer is, and this you'll see in the Karbon the great super commentary on the Yerushalmi, that in such a case, there would be no chiddush in the Mishnah. The Gemara is looking for a case which would have been an insight, a new idea. If it's between old Shekalim and new Shekalim, then certainly we would, in such a suffix, we would put it under old Shekalim. Why? Because what happens to new Shekalim? Eventually, new Shekalim end up in old Shekalim. But the Mishnah should have given the example, so argues the Gemara, of Shekalim and Nidava. Why? Meaning, of Shekalim and Kinim, because that's a bigger chiddush. In fact, we're going to have to analyze why L'chumra is Kinim as opposed to Shekalim. Now, the Mishnah has a case of Shekalim and Nidava, which the Gemara is objecting to because they're on opposite sides. And although there's a big chiddush over here that you have Shekalim versus Nidava, we're trying to figure out why Nidava is L'chumra. and Yiplu Linadava, but nevertheless, the Gemara objects because these two shofars are on opposite ends of the line. The Gemara answers, Rabbi Oven b'shem Rabbi Pinchas, kimin buchlayar. And buchlayar is a kind of an earring that's round in shape. The premise that underlies our question, our objection to the Mishnah is incorrect. Our premise was that the shkalim are in a line. They're not in a line. They're in a circle. And if you draw a circle with all the shkalim around, then what you'll find is that the taklin chadatin are right next to the nedava. So bein shofar shkalim l'shofar nedava is a reference to two contiguous shofars, because we're talking about a circle. Had it been a line, it would be at two ends of the line, they're not proximate. The Mishnah says, Mechza lemechza yiplu linedava. And now we have to figure out why linedava. Wouldn't it make more sense that the mos should be assumed and attributed to shkalim, which are chamurim, because a carbon tzibur is always considered more chamur than a carbon yachid. So when we talk about nedava, that's a nedava of a yachid. There is no such thing as a nedava of a tzibur. But on the other hand, when we're talking about shkalim that were found in a shofar of Trumas Halishka, those monies have to be earmarked for a carbon tzibur. So the Gemara explains, Is the boy Meimar, there were those who wanted to explain our Mishnah as to why, in the case of Safek, we don't attribute these shkalim to the shkalim, is Shema Yiplu Lishiari Alishka. What we're afraid of is, let's say that we attribute these found most to the shkalim, to the taklin chadatin, and what happens in an event that we purchased all the karbanos tzibur that we needed for that year, and the monies that we attributed to shkalim are now mosar, they're surplus. Now the halacha of shiarei halishka, monies that were in the trumas halishka but were never used for karbanos tzibur, is that we use these monies for bedek habayis, which means to fix up the walls of the city. And in that sense, if we attribute it to nedava, that would be a chumrah, because obviously taking something on the mizbeach is more chumur than using it to fix the cracks in the wall. It's the boil of Meimar. There were those who wanted to interpret our Mishnah and explain why the mos are noflim linedava. Mechza mechza kimisha meis. What's the halacha of a carbon and the owner of the carbon died? And here also, it's similar to the case where the owner of the carbon died, because the bailim of the shkalim are unknown, and we cannot attribute each shkalim to any particular person who gave them. And therefore, it's like ein lem bailim, it's like there's no owner. And the halacha is that in a case where you don't know who the owner is Amar Aviyasa Adi Anataman Shomis Kol Rabbi Yehuda Sheshol Shmuel Ifrish Shkol of a mess. So we have a whole long line in which Aviyasa heard from Rabbi Yehuda, who asked Shmuel, "What's the din if you were mafresh a shekel? Reuven was mafresh a shekel, and then he died. What do we do with the shekel, with the mos?" Amalei Shmuel responded to Rabbi Yehuda's question. Yiplu linedava. We use them as an nedava. So if we're going to compare a case of mechzal mechzal, where we cannot identify the bailim, to a case where the bailim died, then shkolim of a bailim that died are earmarked for nedava. So therefore, our Mishnah makes absolute sense when it says yiplu linedava. Now Rav Yasa says, Mosar Asiris Ha'efa Shalo. What happens in the case of the Kohen Gadol, who has to bring on a daily basis what's called Minchas Chavitim for an Asiris Ha'efa, which he splits into two. And now the Kohen Gadol was mafresh mos for that purpose. What do we do with extra mos? If there were a surplus of mos that were dedicated for the Asiris Ha'efa, for the Minchas Chavitim, what happens with those Mosar Mos? And here we have a Machlokas Amoraim, Rabbi Yochanan Amar, Yolicham Liyam HaMelach. We have to destroy these Mos. Rabbi Lazar Amar, Yiplu L'Nedav. They should fall for Nedav. Now the Mishnah tells us that Bein Kinim L'Gozle Ola, an event that we find Mos that are between Kinim and Gozle Ola, then if it's a suffix and it's Mechzal Mechza, Yiplu L'Gozle Ola. So the Gemara asks the following question: Vakasha, the Yesh Chatas Kreva Ola? Wait a second. There is a possibility that these Mos belong to Kinim. And Kinim means a pair of birds, one of which is dedicated as a chatos, called the chatos ha'of, and the other is an ola, which is called an ola ha'of. And the halacha is that a chatos ha'of is karev lamata, meaning below the chut hasikra, the lower part of the mizbeach, whereas an ola ha'of is karev lamala, on the upper half of the mizbeach. And the law is that imshina pasul. So we should be worried about the possibility that these modes are from Kinim, one of which of the pair of karbanos is an olas, is a chatas ha'of. And now you can be makrivit as an ola because you're telling me yiplu gozle ola. So the Gemara answers Chizkiya b'shem Rav Shimon ben Lakish. This whole discussion who Rav Shimon ben Lakish is in the Yerushalmi. But anyway, Tanai Bezdin, who we have a general rule called Tanai Bezdin, otherwise known as Leiv Bezdin Masna. Ala Mosros, in the case of Chatos, if there's, this is a sugya back on Davav, in the case of a Chatos, if there's extra money, Yikruvu Olos, that Leiv Bezdin Masna is going to say that in a case where we cannot earmark the money for Chatos, we reestablish its alignment and it's earmarked for Olos. So here too, when we don't know exactly what to do with these Shekalim, we're going to say use them for Olos, because even if they were originally designated as a kinim for a one of which would be a Chatos, Bezdin is master, they make it tonight, then in such a case where we find the most, so we don't know where they are, they should be karev as olos. Now the Gemara asks another kasha. In a case of mechzal mechza, what are we going to do? We're going to say that these mos belong to the ola, correct? And now the Gemara asks the following question. You're telling me Yiplu Gozle Olos, what happens in an event that this money was actually brought by a Yoledis, and she has to bring not only a carbon Olos, she has to bring a Chatos. On the tzad, which is 50% of a chance that it's actually a Yoledis, and these Shekalim belong to Kinim and not to Gozle Olos. So what are you going to do over here? She doesn't bring a chata. Without a chata, she doesn't have kapara. Now, mechusa kapara means that she can't eat kosher. She can't enter into the Beis Hamikdash. Rabbi Yitzchak Tnai Bezdin Hamesapek es kinim hu mesapek es hapsulos. So again, we're going to activate the principle of Tanai Bezdin. And hamasapek lehegdish sakinim, for example, let's say that one of the two birds, after it was designated, became a treifa. Or, for example, you have a case where one of the ophos got lost. So we have a suffix. We have Mos that got lost. So the halacha is that he brings from his own pocket one oath and then makrav it l'shem chatos for the chovas habaylim. Again, we cannot eat it as a chatos because it's bala suffix. And it's a possibility that it's not a chatos at all. So he says the following: the one who supplies the nests supplies replacements for the lost or disqualified ones. He says the following. This is based on a Mishnah that we didn't get to on Daf Chav. If a woman requires a pair of birds for her kapara, and she deposits the money into this particular shofar for kinim, for bird pairs, the kohen would make sure to use all the coins in bird pairs, in other words, in the kinim, on a daily basis. And they'd buy the equivalent number of bird pairs and offer them on behalf of whoever has deposited the coins, meaning we don't know which coins were deposited by whom. So the kohen will have in mind that whoever had deposited the coins were bringing the birds on their behalf. In that way, anybody depositing coins in kinim would be assured that her bird pair has been offered on that day on her behalf and shall achieve kapara. And the Mishnah teaches that in a case of a coin or a bird that was lost or disqualified, it was a Tanai Bezdin, a stipulation of the court, that the vendor, meaning the seller, who was contracted by the Migdash, by Hegdesh, to supply bird pairs, would have to make up this shortfall as well. And the ownership of these replacements would be legally transferred by proxy to the unknown owner of the lost or disqualified coin or bird, and the subsequent offering of the bird would thereby be credited to her. Now the Gemara asks the following question. Lo tzarcha below. The Mishnah only addresses three scenarios in which we find shkalim between the shofars. Did the Mishnah not feel compelled to add another case of bein ola li eitzim? V'chi lo hayu tzrichim lomer ma yadin k'shenimtzu bein shofar sacherim kigon bein ola li eitzim mechzal mechza yiplu li ola. Kevan sha'ola hi carbon, eitzim rak machshire carbon, v'chein bein levona lizav lekapores, and mechzal metzes levona, which is a carbon, and there are many other cases. Why did the Mishnah limit itself to these particular scenarios? So Gemara answers Tnisa b'sofa, that all the other cases and combinations of lost mos are included in the general principle that's formulated at the end of the Mishnah. Ze'aklal, olchim achar hakorov mechza lemechza laha. Now we get to the second Mishnah on Daf Yud Tesam Al. Moshe nimtzu l'fnei sochare behema b'Yushalayim. Now the people would come with Mos Masechet to Yerushalayim, and they would buy animals. Generally speaking, that's what they did with the money, and they would bring those animals as a korban shlamim. And therefore, whenever I find Mos in front of the vendor who's selling animals in the city of Yerushalayim, Masechet, I assume that those who are coming to buy animals and eat the basar are those who came from all over the land of Israel with their Mos of Masechet. and this is true during the entire year. The most Masechet are there, and when the people come on Aliyah L'Regel 3 times a year, they cannot use up all the most that they have that's most Masechet, so they leave the most in Yerushalayim. And what do we do with most Masechet? As we said before, prominently, it's used for Behemos Shlomim. Therefore, most animals that are sold in Yerushalayim are sold as Shlomim, and the monies that are received for the sale of these animals is most Masechet. So we find most in front of the sochrim, in front of the vendors, and we assume that these most came and they fell from the pocket of the lokhim of those buyers who did not get a chance to purchase the behemoth before they dropped these most, and this is most Masechet. Now, this Gemara, this Mishnah appears in Masechet Pesachim Daf Zayin, and Rashi there says that you might say, wait a minute, maybe the most fell from the mocher, not from the loker. And if they fell from the mocher, they are most chulin, because it's before the actual transaction was effectuated. So Rashi says, Safek Isul L'chumra, and we have to assume L'chumra that they fell from the buyers, from the lokhim, and therefore they're most Masechet. Tosas there himself says, I don't have to apply the principle of Safek L'chumra, but rather I should apply the principle of Rov. For every vendor, there are 10, if not 100 buyers. So there's a greater statistical probability that the most that I found fell from the buyers, one of the various buyers, than it did from the vendor. Now the Mishnah goes on. The Ubaharabais, im nimtzo most barabais, chulin, hareim chulin. Now we're going to assume that the most that we find on the Harbayis are most of the Trumas Halishka. That's where most of the most are on the Harbayis. Now you might ask, okay, if they're Trumas Halishka, why does the Mishnah say it's Chulin? Trumas Halishka is Hegdish. But as we'll soon see in the Gemara, there's a chazaka that the Kohanim, whenever they took the money out of the Trumas Halishka, immediately they did a chilul. And the Meiri writes that we assume that Azlina and Basa Rov, and therefore Rov Mos Hanimtsoim B'Yushalayim Hem Chulin, and even B'Shas HaRegel, says the Meiri, Yesh Mos Meiser, but yet Merubin. He says the following. Okay, this is a little bit more sophisticated. He says that Rov Hashana, most of the year, that means before the Regel, we can assume the most Achulin. During the Regel period, it's probably Maser. But we're going to go Basa Rov Hashana, and therefore we're going to assume they're Chulin. B'Yushalayim. Now, we spoke in the Resha about most that were found in front of the vendors who were selling animals. What happens if we find most anywhere in Yerushalayim? Is Bishar Kol Yemos Hashana during the course of the entire year Chulin, because Rov Mos in the city are Chulin. But B'Shas HaRegel, when there's an influx of Ole Regolim that are holding on to Mos Meiser Sheni, is then a Kol Masa, because Bizman HaRegel, Rov Mos are Meiser Sheni Mos. The Mishnah continues, Basar Shenimtza B'Azara. If we find meat in the Azara, we assume it's Basar Kodesh. It came from a carbon. So the Mishnah says, what carbon did it come from? Was it a carbon mincha? Well, if we find it le'evarim, which means that the meat was not cut up into small portions, but rather larger portions, then olos. Then we assume it's a carbon ola, because a carbon ola is not eaten by the kohanim, so there's no need to cut it into small portions, as opposed to, let's say, a shlomim, which is going to be eaten by the kohanim and by the Israelim and therefore we cut it into smaller pieces of meat. Here we found larger pieces of meat. We can assume, therefore, that this meat is ola. However, l'chatichos, if we find very small cuts, then we should assume l'chumra, that's a chatos, meaning it's eaten by the kohanim, and therefore they cut it into smaller pieces. And this is a chumrah because we could have said, well, maybe it's shlomim. So you could say that that's not a kash at all. We don't have a havdin at shlomim because shlomim would not be found in the Azara. The meat of shlomim is immediately taken anywhere in the city of Yerushalayim. But why not assume it's a korban asham? And the answer is, he quotes here in this footnote to Rivivan that chata shchichi tfei. Asham is a relatively rare korban. Yerushalayim, he finds meat somewhere in Yerushalayim outside of the Azara, is zivchei shlamim. Then we assume that basar in Yerushalayim, most of the basar that's eaten in Yerushalayim is from shlamim. Zeh v'zeh, in all these cases above, we are only assuming that it belongs to a specific category, but we're not assuming that you're going to be able to eat it. You're not allowed to eat it, but rather to ubar tsuraso b'yeit to the beis hasreifa. We cannot eat the basar but rather we're going to wait till it becomes ubar tsuraso, it becomes possibly din nosar, and then we burn it. So why is it important to classify the korban as being either an ola or a chatos or shlomim, and in any event, we're not allowed to eat it? Well, the answer to that question is, just 1 second. Is the following. Although the meat cannot be eaten, it is still important for the Mishnah to rule what category of offering of sacrifice it is. For that ruling informs us that if a person did wrongfully eat the slices of meat found in the Azar, for example, or meat that was found in Yerushalayim, he's not chayav for me'ilah. And why is that? Because there's no me'ilah in the case of chatas or shlomim. And that's a Mishnah in me'ilah on Daf Zayin Amid Beis. Now again, the Mishnah taught us that if he finds meat, then it belongs to a particular category, whether it's olos, chatos, or shlomim. The Mishnah never meant to say that you could actually eat the meat, but rather it's got to be left until ibur tsura. Okay. Now, here is another part of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Nimtza bigvulin. So you found meat outside of Yerushalayim, B'shar Ora Yisrael. If it's a varim, if you find it in large pieces of meat, then nevelos. In other words, when meat is kosher, we cut it into small pieces for eating purposes. When it's nevela, and the shechita was not a valid shechita, then we feed nevela to the animals, to the klavim. Right? Like kelev tashlichet also, the Torah said. So therefore, we're going to leave it in larger limbs. But chatichos, if he finds cut up meat into small pieces, then mutaros, then we assume this is basar kosher. Now here we have to ask the following question. How do you know it's Jewish meat? Maybe it was dropped by a non-Jew. So we have to assume that this is a city that's entirely Jewish. Now we have another question, because the Rambam holds that Basar Shenisalim in Ayin is also, which means that if you don't keep your eye on the meat constantly, then it's also. So that's a question on the Rambam that we leave unanswered.